What if the most famous story of divine judgment in human history was actually a cosmic accident? You're about to discover how a massive asteroid impact that destroyed two of the ancient world's wealthiest cities became the foundation for one of religion's most enduring moral lessons. From the real Sodom and Gomorrah, buried beneath salt and ash, to the eyewitness accounts that evolved into sacred scripture. This is the incredible journey of how natural disaster transformed into divine narrative. The physical evidence is still there, but the story that survived is something entirely different. Between the harsh mountains and the bitter sea, where the earth split open in its deepest wound, paradise itself had taken root. Sweet water bubbled from springs that had never failed, transforming barren wasteland into gardens that rivaled Eden's lost glory, while date palms heavy with golden fruit swayed in warm breezes that carried perfumes more intoxicating than wine. Fields of barley stretched to the horizon like waves of liquid amber, their grain so rich that a single harvest could feed armies for years. Abraham gazed upon this impossible green ribbon threading through the desert and understood why Genesis would remember it as well-watered, like the garden of the Lord. 5 cities rose from this abundance, like jewels scattered by divine hands, Sodom and Gomorrah, commanding the valley's heart with limestone walls gleaming white as ivory, their bronze gates catching fire each dawn as merchants from distant lands gathered to trade in riches that flowed from blessed earth. Impossible wealth bubbled from the ground itself. Natural seeps throughout the region produced bitumen, black gold more precious than silver to Egyptian embalmers and Mesopotamian builders who would pay fortunes for the sticky substance that preserved their greatest works. Caravans stretched for miles as they departed the valley, loaded with treasures that would reshape empires, salt whiter than snow, sulfur pure as sunlight, and metals drawn from veins that seemed inexhaustible. Sodom's king Bera ruled from a palace whose walls were inlaid with gold from distant Ophir. His throne room hung with silks that had traveled the entire breadth of the known world. His feasts lasted from sunset to sunrise, tables groaning beneath delicacies that would have bankrupted lesser kingdoms, honey from sacred groves, wine aged in caves carved from living rock, fruits that grew nowhere else on earth. Gomorrah's ruler, Bersha, matched his neighbor's excess, with palaces built from quarried marble, their courtyards filled with fountains that sang day and night. Here, artists from every nation gathered to create wonders, mosaics that told stories in precious stones, sculptures that seemed to breathe in morning light, tapestries woven with threads of silver and gold that captured scenes from mythology and legend. Each of the 3 lesser cities possessed its own distinctive character and wealth. Adma's skilled metalworkers forged bronze stronger than iron, their secret techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen who signed their works with symbols that proclaimed divine inspiration. Zeboim commanded the crossroads where great trade routes intersected, its markets filled with goods that had traveled impossible distances, ivory from the heart of Africa, pearls from seas that had no names, spices that could preserve meat for years without corruption. Only little Zoar remained humble among its mighty neighbors, its people content with simple prosperity, rather than the intoxicating excess that characterized the greater cities. Here, merchants found honest dealing and fair weights. Travelers discovered genuine hospitality, and children played in streets where laughter still echoed without undertones of cruelty or decadence. Into this paradise came Lot, Abraham's nephew, leading his flocks down from the hills where grazing had grown scarce. The young man's eyes widened as he beheld the valley's abundance, grass that stayed green through seasons when other pastures withered, water that flowed clear and sweet from springs that seemed blessed by heaven itself. His uncle had offered him first choice of territory, and the decision seemed effortless. "I will take the plain," Lot declared, his voice thick with wonder at the prosperity spread before him. The cities beckoned like sirens, their walls promising security, their markets offering opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. A simple herdsman could become a merchant prince in such a place. His children could inherit wealth beyond measure. Abraham watched his nephew descend towards Sodom with eyes that held sadness deeper than farewell. The patriarch's prophetic sight perceived currents flowing beneath the valley's surface beauty, moral rot that festered behind marble facades, spiritual corruption that wealth and comfort had cultivated like gardeners tending poisonous blooms. The city's abundance came at a price that few recognized until the bill came due. Within Sodom's walls, Lot discovered that prosperity had indeed transformed the people as thoroughly as it had enriched them. The ancient laws of hospitality that governed desert life had been corrupted into elaborate displays of wealth rather than genuine care for strangers. Merchants competed to demonstrate their riches through increasingly extravagant gestures, while the poor were forgotten in shadows cast by golden towers. Around each city, sacred groves had been perverted into temples, where Canaanite fertility rituals played out in forms that would have horrified earlier generations. Ancient oaks whose branches had witnessed the world's youth now sheltered priests of Moloch, and their bronze furnaces shaped like their gods' hungry arms. When furnace fires heated metal to red-hot intensity, children were placed upon those searing limbs as offerings to ensure continued prosperity. Screams rising from these groves could be heard throughout the valley, but citizens had learned to close their ears and hearts to sounds that might disturb their comfort. Gold purchased many things, including the silence of consciences that had once known shame. What mattered was that harvests continued, bitumen flowed, and caravans arrived loaded with goods from the ends of the earth. Marble chambers throughout the cities housed temple prostitution that flourished under the guise of sacred mysteries. Worshippers believed they participated in rituals that would increase their wealth and fertility, while men and women alike served as vessels for ceremonies that reduced the divine spark within humanity to mere commerce. Priests who oversaw these degradations grew fat on offerings, while their temples accumulated treasures that rivaled royal hoards. Justice itself became a commodity to be bought and sold in marketplaces where law bent to accommodate those with sufficient gold to reshape it. The powerful fed upon the weak with the calculated efficiency of predators, their methods refined through generations of practice. Courts that should have protected the innocent instead became instruments of oppression, their verdicts predetermined by the weight of purses rather than the merits of cases. In this atmosphere of moral decay disguised as civilization's triumph, Lot found himself slowly transformed from the simple herdsman he had been into something harder and more calculating. The city's golden promises proved as intoxicating as its wine, each success leading to greater ambitions, each compromise making the next betrayal easier to rationalize. His flocks multiplied into vast herds. His modest tent gave way to a house near the city gates. His simple robes were replaced by garments that proclaimed his rising status. Yet even as corruption spread through human hearts, the heavens began to display signs that would have alarmed earlier generations possessed of greater wisdom. Multiple, wandering stars appeared in unusual clusters, their movements defying the orderly patterns that had guided navigators since time began. These celestial messengers traced paths across the night sky that seemed to spell out warnings in languages older than human speech. The moon swelled larger each night, its face bearing expressions that shifted like those of a living being, experiencing profound emotion. Aurora-like lights danced across skies where no such phenomena had ever been recorded, their colors more vivid than any earthly rainbow. These displays painted the darkness with hues that had no names, while their movements suggested intelligence behind their beauty. Animals throughout the region began displaying behavior that disturbed even those who had grown accustomed to ignoring omens. Cattle refused to graze near the cities, despite abundant grass, their eyes rolling white with terror at sights invisible to human perception. Birds fled south in the wrong season, their migrations disrupted by instincts that screamed warnings about dangers approaching from beyond the edge of sight. Dogs howled at empty skies throughout the night, their voices raised in harmonies that spoke of pack knowledge accumulated over generations. These creatures, closest to humans yet still possessed of wild wisdom, sensed approaching doom with accuracy that surpassed any human prophecy. Their warnings went unheeded by masters who had grown deaf to any voice that spoke of consequences for their choices. Even the earth itself began to whisper warnings to those still capable of hearing. Wells that had run cold for centuries suddenly warmed without apparent cause, their waters carrying tastes that spoke of deep changes occurring far below the surface. Fruit ripened in winter's heart, trees bore blossoms out of season, and the very air grew thick with perfumes that belonged to different climates entirely. The smell of sulfur began to seep from deep places, barely noticeable at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. This scent, familiar from the bitumen seeps that had enriched the region, now carried undertones that made sensitive nostrils wrinkle with distaste. Something was stirring in the earth's depths. Forces that had slumbered since the world's foundation were beginning to wake. Ground that had remained stable for millennia developed hairline cracks that appeared overnight and widened by degrees too small for casual observation. These fissures formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the earth itself were preparing to split along predetermined lines. Shepherds reported that their flocks refused to cross certain areas where the fractures were most pronounced, their animals' instincts recognizing dangers that human eyes could not perceive. The night air itself grew strange, carrying sounds that seemed to come from vast distances, rumbles like approaching chariots, whispers in languages that predated human speech, melodies that suggested choirs practicing for some cosmic performance. Those few citizens who still possessed spiritual sensitivity found themselves unable to sleep, their dreams haunted by visions of fire falling from heaven like rain. Ancient astronomical records, kept by temple priests whose knowledge stretched back through generations of careful observation, described similar celestial alignments from times so distant they had passed into legend. These crumbling tablets spoke of previous occasions when the wandering stars had danced in such patterns, and the consequences that had followed those cosmic performances. Cities had vanished, empires had fallen. Entire peoples had been scattered like leaves before hurricane winds. But the priests who possessed this knowledge found their warnings ignored by rulers grown drunk on prosperity. Kings and merchants alike dismissed ancient wisdom as desert superstition, preferring to trust in walls of stone and armies of bronze, rather than heeding voices that spoke of powers beyond human comprehension. They had built their paradise through human effort and intelligence. Surely human strength would be sufficient to protect what they had accomplished. In the markets where wealth flowed like water, fortune tellers from distant lands began appearing with increasing frequency. These seers spoke of visions that had driven them from comfortable homes to seek out the cities of the plain, their messages consistent despite coming from sources that had never communicated with each other. Fire would fall from heaven, they prophesied, transforming abundance into desolation, reducing mighty walls to rubble and ash. The citizens received these prophecies with the mockery that sophisticated people had always reserved for primitive superstitions. They had conquered nature itself, transforming desert wasteland into gardens that surpassed anything their ancestors had imagined. Their engineering skills had created aqueducts that carried water across impossible distances. Their architectural achievements had produced buildings that seemed to touch the very dome of heaven. What could the gods do to them that they could not undo through human ingenuity and determination? Their wealth could purchase armies. Their technology could overcome natural obstacles. Their civilization represented the triumph of reason over the chaos that had ruled earlier ages. They had transcended the limitations that bound lesser peoples to lives of subsistence and fear. Yet even as they dismissed the warnings, some among them began making preparations that revealed unconscious awareness of approaching danger. Wealthy merchants quietly diversified their holdings, moving portions of their treasure to distant cities where political instability posed the greatest threat they could imagine. Military commanders strengthened their forces and reinforced their walls, telling themselves they were merely taking prudent precautions against human enemies. The most sensitive souls among the population found excuses to travel, their subconscious minds driving them to seek distance from sources of unease they could not consciously identify. Caravans departing the valley carried more passengers than usual, while the flow of immigrants seeking to join the city's prosperity slowed to a trickle. The valley's magnetic attraction, which had drawn fortune seekers for generations, was beginning to reverse itself. In his house near Sodom's gates, Lot felt the weight of approaching crisis settling upon his shoulders, like a cloak woven from shadows. His uncle Abraham's teachings echoed in memory, ancient lessons about the importance of hospitality, justice, and remembrance of divine authority. These principles seemed quaint and outdated in a world where success was measured by accumulation rather than character. Yet something stirred in the merchant prince's heart, a recognition that the prosperity surrounding him rested upon foundations less stable than they appeared. The wealth that had transformed him from herdsman to notable had come at costs he was only beginning to calculate. His children were growing up in an environment where cruelty was entertainment and corruption was sophistication, where the weak existed only to serve the strong and conscience was a luxury few could afford. The Jordan Valley basked beneath skies that painted each sunset in colors more magnificent than any artist could capture, while the cities of the plain celebrated their triumph over nature's limitations. Their walls gleamed with reflected light. Their markets buzzed with activity that never ceased. Their temples rang with songs that praised human achievement above all other accomplishments. But in the depths of space, beyond the reach of human observation, ancient forces were converging toward an appointment that had been written in the stars since before the first city raised its walls. The wandering star that would soon split the heavens like a sword of fire was racing toward its destiny, carrying within its cosmic heart the power to transform paradise into legend, abundance into memory, triumph into the most enduring cautionary tale humanity would ever inherit. The age of innocence was ending, though few recognized the signs that proclaimed its conclusion. Soon the peaceful nights would give way to terrors beyond imagination. The prosperous days would be consumed by fires that burned hotter than furnaces, and the golden cities would become names whispered in fear by generations yet unborn. But for now, in these final moments before destiny claimed its due, the sun still shone upon walls of gleaming stone. Children still played in streets where laughter echoed without irony, and the Jordan Valley remained the closest thing to paradise that mortal eyes had ever beheld. The ending was approaching with cosmic inevitability, but the beauty that would perish in that ending possessed a quality that would ensure its remembrance long after the flames had cooled and the ashes had been scattered by desert winds. Tomorrow would bring strangers to Sodom's gates, messengers whose presence would herald the beginning of the end. But today, in the golden light of afternoon, the cities of the plain stood in their glory, unconscious monuments to both human achievement and human blindness, destined to become the measure by which divine judgment would be understood, until the stars themselves grew cold and dark. Beneath the spreading oaks of Mamre, where shadows danced in patterns older than human memory, Abraham sat in the doorway of his tent as the day reached its burning zenith. Heat waves rose from the desert floor like transparent flames, distorting the horizon until earth and sky became indistinguishable. In this hour, when even the hardiest travelers sought shelter, when the very air shimmered with furnace-like intensity, 3 figures appeared on the distant path. Their approach defied the desert's harsh logic. Where others moved with the careful conservation of those who knew the sun's power to kill, these strangers walked with unhurried confidence, their garments unmarked by dust, their faces showing no trace of the exhaustion that marked all who traveled in such heat. As they drew closer, something in their bearing made Abraham's weathered heart leap with recognition beyond understanding. Without hesitation, the patriarch rose and ran toward them, an action that would have seemed madness to any observer, for no man of his years should have possessed such vigor in the day's crushing heat. His voice carried across the wasteland as he called out the ancient formula of hospitality. "My lords, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." What followed was a feast prepared with supernatural haste, as if time itself bent to accommodate divine purposes. Sarah, his wife, kneaded cakes from their finest meal, while Abraham selected a tender calf from his herds. The food appeared before the guests with speed that suggested more than mortal efficiency, while curds and milk were set beside bread still warm from hastily built ovens. As his mysterious guests partook of earthly sustenance, their words carried weight that pressed against the boundaries of human understanding. They spoke of Sarah bearing a son despite her advanced years, of promises that would reshape the destiny of nations. But beneath these wonder-filled pronouncements ran darker currents, the scent of judgment hanging in the air like smoke from distant fires. When 2 of the visitors departed toward the valley, where Sodom's walls gleamed in afternoon light, Abraham found himself walking beside the 3rd, whose presence seemed to command the very elements around them. In the growing twilight, as stars began their eternal dance across the desert sky, the patriarch learned why his divine guest lingered. The Lord's voice carried the weight of cosmic authority as he revealed his purpose. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. What followed was bargaining that would echo through every generation, a mortal man pleading with divine justice for the lives of the wicked. Abraham's voice carried the weight of desperate hope as he began his careful negotiation. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the settlement. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Back and forth the ancient dance continued, numbers falling like leaves in autumn wind. 50 righteous souls, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20. Each reduction brought Abraham closer to the terrible truth he had sensed from the moment his divine visitor spoke of judgment. Finally, with voice barely above a whisper, he made his last desperate plea. "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. came the reply that sealed Sodom's fate, even as it revealed the depths of divine mercy. As twilight deepened into night, two figures approached the massive gates where Lot sat conducting the day's final business. The merchant prince had risen far from his shepherd's origins, his position near the entrance proclaiming his status among the notable citizens. Yet something in the approaching strangers stirred memories of his uncle's teachings about hospitality, sacred as blood itself. Where Sodom's other citizens saw only travel-stained wanderers of no particular importance, Lot perceived something that made his spirit tremble. Their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect starlight from realms beyond human sight, while their movements carried an otherworldly grace that spoke of beings for whom Earth's laws were mere suggestions rather than absolute constraints. Rising to his feet, Lot bowed low in the ancient manner, his voice carrying genuine warmth as he extended the invitation that would mark him forever as different from his adopted city. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." The stranger's initial refusal followed the traditional pattern of polite discourse. "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But Lot's urgency transcended mere social convention. Something in their presence awakened prophetic echoes he had inherited from Abraham's lineage, warnings that whispered of dangers beyond ordinary human understanding. "I beg you, my lords, do not spend the night in the square," he insisted with intensity that surprised even himself. In the settlement streets after dark, travelers faced perils that went beyond simple robbery or assault. The municipality's corruption had bred appetites that fed on innocence itself, hungers that no wealth could satisfy and no law restrain. Finally persuaded by his passionate entreaties, the strangers followed Lot to his house, where he prepared a feast despite the lateness of the hour. Bread was baked, wine was poured, and water heated for the washing of feet dusty from long travel. Yet even as hospitality flowed like healing balm, darkness was gathering in the city's twisted heart. Word of the stranger's arrival spread through Sodom's streets with the speed of fire consuming dry tinder. In taverns, where wine loosened tongues already prone to evil speech. In brothels, where gold purchased what love should freely give. In private chambers, where the wealthy planned their next exploitation of the weak. Whispers carried news of fresh prey delivered to their very gates. What followed was a phenomenon that revealed the true depths of Sodom's corruption. From every quarter of the city they came, young and old, rich and poor, united in appetite that transcended every boundary of age, class, and natural affection. This was not the work of a criminal minority, but the expression of desires that had infected the entire population, like plague spreading through corrupted blood. They surrounded Lot's house like wolves circling wounded prey, their voices raised in demands that transformed the night air into something thick with malevolence. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they cried with one voice. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." In that moment, the full magnitude of Sodom's fall from grace stood revealed. These were not ignorant savages acting from primitive instinct, but sophisticated citizens of a prosperous civilization who had chosen to transform themselves into something worse than beasts. Their corruption was informed, deliberate, and absolute. Evil perfected through generations of practice until it had become as natural as breathing. Lot stood between his guests and the howling mob, his voice trembling with horror at what his adopted city had become. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly," he pleaded, knowing even as he spoke that his words would fall on ears that had learned to hear only the voice of their own appetites. What happened next would haunt Lot for the remainder of his days, an offer so desperate, so morally compromised, that it revealed how thoroughly even righteous men could be corrupted by proximity to absolute evil. Rather than surrender his guests to the mob's unspeakable intentions, he offered his own daughters as substitutes, virgin flesh to satisfy appetites that knew no natural boundaries. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man," he cried, his voice breaking with shame and terror. "Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." The mob's response revealed that their corruption had advanced beyond even the degraded offerings Lot presented in his desperation. They had moved past mere physical appetite into realms where violation of divine order itself had become their drug of choice. "Stand back," they roared with one voice. "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." What they sought was not simple gratification, but the deliberate destruction of everything that remained pure in their world. The strangers represented otherness, mystery, perhaps even divinity itself, qualities that their corrupted souls could not tolerate. They would violate these visitors not from desire, but from hatred of the transcendent, from need to drag down anything that reminded them of what they had abandoned. As the mob pressed forward with violence that promised to tear Lot's house apart stone by stone, the strangers finally revealed their true nature. Hands reached out from within the doorway, hands that moved with authority over forces that governed reality itself. Every member of the mob, from the youngest to the oldest, found themselves struck with blindness so complete that they could not locate the very door they had been besieging. But this was not mere physical blindness. What afflicted them was spiritual darkness made manifest, the internal corruption of their souls expressed in the failure of their earthly sight. They groped like men drowning in midnight seas, their fingers clawing at empty air while the entrance to Lot's house remained as unreachable as if it existed in another dimension entirely. Even in their supernatural affliction, they continued their assault, wearing themselves out in futile attempts to find what their blindness had hidden from them. This persistence revealed the ultimate tragedy of Sodom's corruption, evil so complete that not even divine intervention could turn it from its chosen path. Within the house, the strangers cast off the last pretense of mortality. When they spoke now, their voices carried harmonies that resonated in dimensions beyond human perception, while their forms blazed with light too intense for unprotected eyes to witness. These were not men, but messengers of divine justice, angels whose presence on earth meant that heaven itself had taken notice of what transpired in the cities of the plain. "Have you anyone else here?" they asked Lot with urgency that transcended mortal time. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Lot's mission to warn his family revealed the full extent of how deeply Sodom's poison had penetrated even righteous households. His sons-in-law, men who should have trusted the patriarch's word above all earthly considerations, heard his warnings with laughter that carried undertones of genuine contempt. To them, talk of divine judgment seemed the babbling of an old man whose mind had been affected by desert heat and foreign superstitions. "Up! Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city," Lot pleaded with them, his voice carrying desperation that should have penetrated any heart still capable of natural affection. But prosperity had made them deaf to warnings that threatened their comfortable assumptions about how the world operated. They had grown up in the golden settlement's embrace, their characters shaped by a civilization that measured worth in accumulated wealth and personal pleasure. The idea that their magnificent metropolis, with its impregnable walls, its overflowing treasuries, its armies that had never known defeat, could face destruction from invisible forces seemed not just unlikely, but actively ridiculous. "The old man has lost his mind," they whispered among themselves, their laughter carrying across courtyards where fountains played eternal songs of prosperity. What god would destroy a city that produces such wealth? What divine power could overcome walls built to last for millennia? Their mockery was not born of simple ignorance, but of sophisticated reasoning that had weighed earthly evidence and found heavenly warnings wanting. They possessed educated minds that could calculate compound interest and plan trade routes across continents. They understood engineering principles that supported massive architectural projects and military strategies that had secured their city's dominance throughout the region. What they lacked was wisdom ancient enough to recognize that some powers operated according to laws that transcended human understanding. Their education had become their blindness. Their sophistication had transformed into folly. Their success had bred the arrogance that would cost them everything they treasured. As dawn approached with inexorable certainty, the angel's patience reached its appointed limit. Time itself seemed to accelerate as they grasped Lot and his family, those few who would accept salvation, even when it came wrapped in terror beyond description. The Lord being merciful to him, they dragged the reluctant merchant and his household from the only home they had known into the pre-dawn darkness where destiny waited, with cosmic scales balanced for judgment. Behind them, Sodom's gates remained sealed against the night, its citizens sleeping peacefully in beds purchased with corrupted gold. The wealthy dreamed of tomorrow's profits, while the poor planned their survival through another day of servitude. None suspected that time itself had reached its final hour for the cities of the plain. Guards on the walls watched for human enemies, while the greatest threat in their history raced toward them through the star-filled darkness of space. Their sophisticated civilization had prepared defenses against every danger their educated minds could imagine, yet they remained helpless before a force they could not conceive. In his throne room, where treasures from a dozen kingdoms gleamed by lamplight, King Bera reviewed reports of trade agreements and military alliances. His advisors spoke of expanding markets and new sources of wealth, their voices confident with the assurance of men who had never known failure. What power on earth could threaten their golden paradise? Throughout the valley, in Gomorrah and Admah, in Zeboim and Little Zoar, similar scenes played out as the prosperous slept secure in their achievements. Their walls were strong, their armies mighty, their treasuries overflowing with riches that could purchase solutions to any problem they could imagine. High above their heads, invisible to naked eyes but racing with mechanical precision toward its appointment with destiny, their cosmic visitor completed its billion-year journey through the void. Physics and divine judgment were about to converge in an explosion that would transform paradise into legend, abundance into the most enduring cautionary tale humanity would ever inherit. The strangers who had walked among them, who had been mocked and dismissed and finally driven away, carried with them the last mercy that heaven would extend to the cities of the plain. Their mission was complete, their warning delivered, their final act of compassion expressed in the saving of those few who possessed ears to hear and hearts to believe. What followed would exceed every category of human experience, requiring new words to describe and new stories to contain. The greatest religious narrative in history was about to be born from the raw materials of cosmic impact, transforming natural disaster into moral instruction that would echo through every generation until the stars themselves grew cold. Dawn was coming, and with it, the fire that would forge legend from the ruins of paradise. As the immediate violence of impact gave way to the slower destruction of continuing fires, as the pillar of smoke climbed ever higher into a sky suddenly empty of birds, as the Jordan Depression settled into its new role as monument to divine justice, the transformation from celestial accident to religious truth had already begun in the minds of those who witnessed events beyond their power to explain through natural causes alone. Genesis would record his observation with brevity that concealed the emotional weight of witnessing such destruction. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward the settlements of the plain, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Miles above the devastation, the asteroid's passage through the atmosphere created secondary effects that painted the sky in colors visible across multiple kingdoms. What had been the most fertile basin in the known world became a wasteland where the earth itself burned, fed by underground deposits of oil and gas that would continue smoldering for years after the initial impact. But the most devastating consequence came from the region's unique geology. Centuries of bitumen seepage had saturated the soil with petroleum compounds that ignited in chain reactions when touched by celestial fire. How a meteor strike became one of history's greatest religious stories. Peaceful darkness reigned over the Jordan Valley as the final evening's deception played out in rooftop gardens where laughter echoed between marble columns. Wine flowed like water through the great settlement's halls, while wealthy merchants counted their gold by lamplight, their fingers caressing coins that bore the images of distant kings. In Gomorrah's palace courtyards, musicians played melodies that had never known sorrow, their notes dancing on night air perfumed with blossoms that bloomed only in this blessed valley. None suspected that high above their heads, racing through the star-filled void at 17 miles per second, a mountain of ice and stone was completing its 4 billion-year journey toward an appointment written in the very laws of physics. The celestial visitor had already begun to glow with the friction of its passage through Earth's upper atmosphere, its surface heating to temperatures that transformed frozen water into superheated steam. In the settlement's markets, night traders hawked their wares beneath torches that cast dancing shadows on walls built to last forever. Bitumen merchants closed deals that would send their black gold to Egyptian embalmers and Mesopotamian builders, while salt traders arranged shipments to kingdoms beyond the edge of known maps. The sounds of prosperity filled the air, the clink of coins, the creak of laden wagons, the voices of men who had never known want planning their next ventures into unimaginable wealth. King Bera sat in his throne room, reviewing reports that spoke only of success. His advisors brought news of trade agreements signed, military alliances forged, and tribute flowing from subject peoples who paid gladly for the privilege of sharing in the valley's abundance. Tomorrow would bring fresh caravans loaded with treasures, new opportunities for expansion, greater glories for a civilization that had conquered nature itself. But even as human confidence reached its peak, the universe prepared to demonstrate the fragility of all earthly achievement. The wandering star had entered the final phase of its approach, its blazing passage through the atmosphere, creating a tail of superheated gas that stretched across hundreds of miles of sky. Yet the brilliant streak remained invisible to eyes turned earthward, focused on treasures that would prove as temporary as morning mist. Genesis would record the timing with precision that spoke of divine appointment rather than random chance. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. Dawn was approaching as the cosmic messenger raced toward its target. the moment of impact calculated by gravitational forces that had operated unchanged since the solar system began its eternal dance around the sun. From his refuge in Little Zoar, the only settlement humble enough to escape divine wrath, Lot gazed back toward the prosperity he had abandoned. In the growing light of dawn, the great metropolis still gleamed with ivory walls and bronze gates, its towers reaching toward heaven like fingers of human pride. No shadow of approaching doom marked its perfect facades. No sign disturbed the peaceful rhythm of early morning activity, as guards changed shifts on walls built to withstand any earthly assault. Far to the west, Abraham stood vigil on the heights near Hebron, his prophetic sight drawn toward the fertile plain where his nephew had chosen abundance over righteousness. The patriarch's eyes, sharpened by decades of walking with the Almighty, perceived currents in the air that spoke of approaching transformation beyond human comprehension. In those final moments before physics and theology converged in an explosion that would reshape human understanding of divine justice, witnesses across the ancient world began to see what none of them could explain. In Egypt, priests tending sacred fires in Memphis temples paused as an unnatural brightness appeared in the eastern sky. In Babylon, astronomers who had spent lifetimes mapping the heavens watched a new star race across familiar constellations with speed that defied every law they understood. The celestial visitor announced its arrival with phenomena that transcended ordinary experience. A streak brighter than the full moon split the pre-dawn sky like a sword forged from concentrated starlight, its passage creating thunderclaps that shook mountains hundreds of miles away. The very air began to scream as the asteroid's passage compressed atmospheric gases to densities that generated temperatures hotter than any earthly furnace. Birds throughout the region fell silent, their ancient instincts recognizing the approach of something that belonged to realms beyond their comprehension. Cattle huddled together in terror, their eyes rolling white as electromagnetic disturbances from the visitor's passage interfered with navigation systems older than human civilization. Dogs raised their voices in harmonies that spoke of knowledge accumulated through countless generations, warning songs for a catastrophe their wild wisdom could sense but not prevent. In the great settlement streets, early risers paused in their morning routines as unnatural light began to paint the eastern horizon in colors that had no earthly names. Merchants preparing for the day's trading looked up from their calculations to see the sky itself catching fire, ribbons of superheated gas streaming behind a visitor whose nature lay beyond their sophisticated understanding. Some pointed in wonder at the celestial display, calling their neighbors to witness beauty that surpassed their grandest festivals. Others felt ancient fears stirring in their hearts, recognition that this phenomenon belonged to categories of experience their ancestors had warned them about, in stories dismissed as primitive superstition. The asteroid struck the fertile plain at precisely the moment Genesis recorded, its impact releasing energy equivalent to thousands of the mightiest weapons humanity would ever devise. The wandering mountain, perhaps half a mile in diameter and traveling faster than any earthly projectile, encountered the petroleum-rich geology of the Jordan Rift, with results that exceeded every category of natural disaster. Physics operated with mechanical precision as kinetic energy transformed into heat that instantly vaporized everything within miles of ground zero. The impact created a fireball that climbed toward heaven like a pillar of pure destruction, its core reaching temperatures that matched the interior of stars. Shock waves radiated outward at supersonic speeds, their passage through the earth creating seismic disturbances that registered on every fault line from the Mediterranean to the Arabian desert. But the most devastating consequence came from the valley's unique geology. Centuries of bitumen seepage had saturated the soil, with petroleum compounds that ignited in chain reactions when touched by celestial fire. What began as a cosmic impact became a conflagration that consumed every combustible material across thousands of square miles, transforming the garden paradise into a furnace that burned with supernatural intensity. Sodom's magnificent walls, built from limestone, quarried to last millennia, cracked like eggshells under pressure waves that compressed and released faster than human perception could follow. Bronze gates that had withstood the assault of armies melted like wax in a flame, their metal transformed into rivers of liquid fire that flowed through streets suddenly empty of everything that had made them precious. The great palace, where King Bera had reviewed his reports of prosperity, became a mountain of rubble in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Throne rooms, decorated with gold from the ends of the earth, collapsed into cellars where wine that had aged for generations boiled away in superheated steam. Treasuries filled with coins bearing the images of distant kings became furnaces where precious metals fused into unrecognizable masses. Gomorrah suffered the same instantaneous destruction, its architectural wonders reduced to fragments scattered across a landscape suddenly transformed beyond recognition. The fountains that had sung eternal symphonies in marble courtyards fell silent, as the very stones that had contained them vaporized in temperatures that exceeded any earthly comparison. Miles away from the impact site, the shock wave's passage announced itself with a roar that human language possessed no words to describe. Sound itself became a weapon that shattered glass, toppled towers, and made the earth itself ring like a struck bell. Abraham, watching from his distant vantage point near Hebron, felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, as if the very foundations of creation were being tested. The pillar of fire that rose from ground zero climbed through every layer of the atmosphere, creating a column of destruction visible from hundreds of miles away. Smoke darker than midnight, mixed with flames brighter than noon, while debris from the vaporized settlements fell like deadly rain across the entire region. This was the smoke of the land that Genesis would record, rising like the smoke of a furnace, a description that captured both the scale of destruction and its supernatural appearance to eyes that had never witnessed anything comparable. For 9 mighty strides, the effects of the impact radiated outward through the geological structure of the Jordan Depression. Each successive wave of destruction reached further from ground zero, carrying with it the complete elimination of everything that had made the region precious. Fields of golden barley became seas of flame that consumed their own substance, while orchards that had produced fruit unknown anywhere else on earth became pillars of fire that climbed toward the dome of heaven. Throughout this cosmic violence, Lot's wife made the fatal choice that would transform her from refugee into eternal monument. Despite the angel's explicit warnings, do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley, she turned to gaze upon the destruction of everything she had treasured: her house with its fine furnishings, her friends with their sophisticated conversation, her social position among the notable women of the community. All were being consumed by fires that fell from heaven like rain. What Genesis records as her transformation into a pillar of salt may have been the result of the blast wave's chemical effects, superheated gases carrying mineral compounds that could preserve organic matter through processes that simulated instantaneous fossilization. Or perhaps divine judgment operated according to principles that transcended mere physics, transforming disobedience into eternal warning for generations yet unborn. The settlements of the plain became names without substance, their walls scattered like sand before wind that carried temperatures hot enough to melt bronze. Adma's metalworkers, with their secret techniques for creating alloys stronger than iron, perished with their knowledge, their workshops becoming furnaces that burned with colors no earthly fire had ever produced. Zeboim's markets, where goods from the ends of the earth had changed hands daily, became empty spaces where only ash remained to mark locations that had once buzzed with the activity of international commerce. Animals throughout the region died where they stood, their bodies flash-burned by radiant heat that traveled at the speed of light. Cattle that had grazed in pastures greener than emerald became shadows etched into stones that would puzzle future generations of observers. Birds fell from skies suddenly filled with toxic gases, while fish in streams and ponds boiled instantly in water superheated beyond any temperature compatible with life. The very air caught fire as petroleum vapors mixed with oxygen, in combinations that created flames reaching thousands of degrees. What had been the most fertile valley in the known world became a wasteland where the earth itself burned, fed by underground deposits of oil and gas that would continue smoldering for years after the initial impact. Miles above the devastation, the cosmic visitor's passage through the atmosphere created secondary effects that painted the sky in colors visible across multiple kingdoms. Fragments of the shattered asteroid, glowing white-hot from atmospheric friction, fell like burning snow across vast areas of the ancient Near East. Some of these fragments, meteorites carrying the chemical signature of their cosmic origin, would be gathered by survivors and treasured as proof that fire had literally fallen from heaven. From his vantage point near Hebron, Abraham watched the pillar of smoke and flame climb toward the very vault of heaven, its massive column visible despite the distance that separated him from ground zero. The patriarch's heart, already burdened with foreknowledge of what divine judgment meant for those he had failed to save, now witnessed the awesome reality of cosmic forces unleashed in service of moral law. Genesis would record his observation with brevity that concealed the emotional weight of witnessing such destruction. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward the settlements of the valley, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. In Little Zoar, the only community whose humility had earned divine mercy, Lot and his surviving daughters felt the earth shake beneath their feet as shockwaves from the impact reached even their distant refuge. The roar of destruction filled their ears like the voice of judgment itself, while the pillar of fire painted their faces with light that belonged to no earthly source. What they witnessed exceeded every category of human experience, requiring new language to describe and new stories to contain. The cosmic collision had indeed destroyed the wicked settlements as the angels promised, but the manner of that destruction, fire falling from heaven, the earth itself opening to swallow cities, the very air becoming an instrument of divine wrath, demanded interpretation that went beyond mere natural philosophy. They had no framework for understanding kinetic energy released by cosmic impact, no knowledge of the chemical reactions that had transformed petroleum deposits into weapons of mass destruction, no comprehension of how atmospheric friction could heat stone and ice to temperatures that rivaled the interior of stars. What they possessed instead was unshakable certainty that they had witnessed divine judgment executed with precision that targeted the guilty while sparing the righteous. The cosmic visitor, its 4-billion-year journey finally complete, had transformed natural disaster into the raw material from which humanity's greatest moral legend would be constructed. Physics had provided the mechanism, but theology would provide the meaning, explaining why these particular settlements had been chosen for destruction, why their prosperity had attracted such terrible attention, why their story would echo through every generation until the stars themselves grew cold. As the immediate violence of impact gave way to the slower destruction of continuing fires, as the pillar of smoke climbed ever higher into a sky suddenly empty of birds, as the Jordan Valley settled into its new role as monument to divine justice. The transformation from cosmic accident to religious truth had already begun in the minds of those who witnessed events beyond their power to explain through natural causes alone. The night sky had indeed caught fire, but what burned in that celestial conflagration was more than petroleum and stone. It was the birth of legend itself, forged in temperatures that would ensure its survival long after every other memory of that ancient world had crumbled into forgotten dust. The wind wandered through hollow streets, carrying no sound but its own, in a place where silence would outlast all things. The greatest religious story in human history had been born from the marriage of cosmic violence and moral necessity, creating meaning from destruction that would outlast the very stars that had witnessed its fiery beginning. When the first light of dawn struggled to penetrate the choking haze that hung over the Jordan Depression, the sun itself seemed reluctant to illuminate what the night had wrought. A blood-red orb fought its way through smoke so thick it transformed morning into a twilight painted in shades of judgment, while ash fell like grey snow across a landscape that no longer resembled anything recognizable from the world of yesterday. Where gardens had bloomed in impossible profusion, where golden barley had waved like liquid amber in warm breezes, where date palms had offered shade to travelers from distant lands, nothing remained but salt-crusted wasteland that stretched toward horizons made invisible by drifting clouds of destruction. The very air tasted of endings, bitter with minerals thrown up from deep places, acrid with the smoke of petroleum fires that would burn for years to come. Abraham descended from his vigil near Hebron, with eyes that had witnessed the birth of legend itself. The patriarch's weathered face bore the weight of knowledge that few mortals could carry, the terrible understanding that divine justice, when finally unleashed, exceeded every category of human imagination. Behind him, the pillar of smoke still climbed toward heaven, like a monument built from the substance of catastrophe itself. The geological wound left by the celestial visitor gaped like an open mouth in the Earth's surface, its depth revealing layers of rock that had been hidden since the world's foundation. What had been the lowest depression on the planet's surface had been driven even deeper, creating a scar that would remain visible until the end of time. Into this cosmic crater, waters would soon flow to create a sea so bitter that no fish could live within its depths, so dense with dissolved minerals that no man could sink beneath its surface. Lot stood at the edge of this transformation with his surviving daughters, their faces streaked with ash that fell like judgment's rain. Behind them, little Zoar cowered in the shadow of the great destruction, its humble buildings untouched by the fire that had consumed their magnificent neighbors. The contrast was absolute. Where pride had built towers reaching toward heaven, only silence remained. Where humility had been content with simple prosperity, life continued in grateful acknowledgement of mercy beyond understanding. The salt pillar that had been Lot's wife stood eternal watch over the ruins, her crystallized form catching the blood-red light of dawn in ways that made her seem almost alive. Minerals that had preserved her body in perfect detail would resist both weather and time, a monument to the fatal price of glancing back when fate demanded she move on. Travelers would find her in the same position for generations to come, her face still turned toward the ash-covered remnants of everything she had valued more than obedience. Across the transformed landscape, evidence of the night's violence lay scattered like broken toys left by cosmic children. Fragments of buildings fused into green glass by temperatures that had briefly matched the interior of stars gleamed among the rubble like jewels born from destruction. These pieces would be gathered by survivors, and carried to distant lands as proof that fire had literally fallen from heaven, physical testimony to support stories that would otherwise seem too incredible for belief. The silence was absolute. No bird sang, no insect buzzed, no wind stirred the ash-covered stones. Where 10,000 voices had once risen in commerce and corruption, in laughter and lamentation, in the complex symphony of human civilization at its peak, only emptiness remained. The very concept of sound seemed to have died with the cities, leaving behind a quiet so complete it pressed against the ears like physical weight. Streams that had flowed clear and sweet from springs blessed by heaven now ran thick with dissolved salt, their waters carrying the taste of tears shed by the earth itself. Fish that had swum in these currents for countless generations floated belly up on surfaces that reflected no light, their silver scales dulled by chemical changes that had transformed life-giving water into liquid death. The regional tremor caused by the celestial impact had been felt as far away as Egypt and Mesopotamia, where scribes would record in their chronicles that the earth itself had shaken with divine displeasure. Moabites and Ammonites, dwelling in their mountain strongholds, had watched the pillar of fire climb toward the dome of heaven, and understood that the God of Abraham had spoken with a voice that made the strongest walls tremble. In the smoking crater that had been Sodom's marketplace, where merchants from the ends of the earth had once gathered to trade in treasures beyond price, nothing remained but fused sand and twisted metal. The bitumen that had made the settlement wealthy lay exposed in black pools that would burn for decades, their flames fed by petroleum deposits that the impact had cracked open like broken eggs. Gomorrah's architectural marvels had been reduced to geometric patterns in the ash, straight lines and perfect circles that marked where walls and towers had stood, before temperatures exceeding any earthly furnace had reduced worked stone to its component elements. The fountains that had sung eternal symphonies in marble courtyards were now filled with salt water that would never again support life or beauty. Animals throughout the region lay where they had fallen, their bodies flash-burned by radiant heat that had traveled at the speed of light. Some had been caught in the act of fleeing, their final moments preserved in ash that would harden around them like natural sculpture. Others showed no sign of having sensed their approaching doom, their peaceful postures suggesting death had come too quickly for fear or pain. The transformation of the fertile plain into lifeless wasteland sent shockwaves through the entire ancient Near East that went far beyond mere seismic disturbance. Trade routes that had connected empires suddenly led nowhere, their endpoints erased from existence in a single night of judgment. Caravans approaching from distant lands found familiar landmarks replaced by salt formations and ash-covered rubble, their navigational knowledge made obsolete by divine intervention. Kings and princes who had depended on the valley's wealth for their own prosperity discovered that their carefully planned economies had been built on foundations that could vanish without warning. The black gold that had flowed from Sodom's markets would flow no more, while the salt and sulfur that had commanded premium prices in foreign markets were now available only as bitter reminders of vanished abundance. In Egypt, where Sodom's bitumen had preserved the bodies of pharaohs for their journey into eternity, embalmers would need to seek new sources for their sacred craft. The interruption of supply would drive up prices throughout the ancient world, creating economic ripples that would be felt in palaces from the Nile to the Euphrates. Mesopotamian builders who had relied on the valley's petroleum products as mortar for their greatest architectural achievements found themselves forced to develop new techniques or watch their projects crumble for lack of binding materials that had seemed inexhaustible. The Tower of Babel itself, rising in defiance of heavenly authority, would stand uncompleted as divine judgment demonstrated the futility of human pride built on foundations that could be swept away in a single night. The few survivors who had escaped the immediate devastation wandered like ghosts through landscapes they no longer recognized. Some had been traveling on distant trade routes when the fire fell, returning to find empty spaces where their homes and families had been. Others had fled the settlements in the final hours before impact, driven by dreams or omens they couldn't explain but dared not ignore. These refugees carried with them stories that would evolve with each telling, memories of the night sky catching fire, transformed by trauma and time into accounts of divine messengers and supernatural intervention. What they had witnessed exceeded the capacity of human language to describe, requiring new metaphors and mythological frameworks to contain experiences that challenged every assumption about how the world operated. In the camps where survivors gathered to share their testimonies, accounts of the destruction began to take on the structure of moral instruction. The cities had been wealthy beyond measure, yet their wealth had not protected them. They had been powerful beyond rival, yet their power had crumbled like sand before forces they couldn't comprehend. They had been sophisticated in their philosophy and advanced in their technology, yet their knowledge had proven worthless against judgment that operated according to laws their education had never taught them to recognize. These stories would spread with the speed of wildfire across the ancient world, carried by traders and travelers, diplomats and refugees, until every court from Egypt to Babylon possessed some version of the tale. Each retelling would add new details while preserving the essential truth, that divine justice, when finally unleashed, could accomplish in a single night what human armies could not achieve in lifetimes of warfare. The memory keepers among the various tribes began the work that would transform eyewitness testimony into sacred narrative. Bards and storytellers, priests and prophets, all recognized in these events the raw material for legends that would outlast the civilizations that created them. The destruction of the cities by cosmic impact would be recalled not as accident of nature, but as a purposeful strike to illustrate the moral codes linking the world below and the heavens above. Pilgrims began arriving within weeks of the catastrophe, drawn by reports that God himself had intervened in human affairs with violence that exceeded biblical precedent. They came seeking signs and wonders, physical evidence of supernatural power, tangible proof that the moral order of the universe remained intact despite appearances of chaos and injustice in their own times. What they found exceeded their expectations. The salt formations that had been Lot's wife provided unmistakable testimony to the reality of divine judgment, while the green glass fragments scattered throughout the ruins offered proof that temperatures beyond earthly capacity had indeed fallen from heaven. The continuing petroleum fires served as eternal flames marking sacred ground where holiness and horror had met in perfect balance. These early pilgrims established the tradition of carrying away relics from the site, pieces of fused stone, crystals of pure salt, samples of ash that had once been the walls of mighty cities. These fragments would find their way into temples and treasuries throughout the known world, physical testimony supporting oral traditions that might otherwise have been dismissed as exaggeration or myth. The waters that collected in the newly deepened crater began displaying properties that defied natural explanation. Their density approached that of liquid metal, making drowning impossible, while rendering swimming an exercise in futility. Their mineral content was so concentrated that even tiny amounts brought to the mouth caused immediate revulsion, while contact with skin produced burning sensations that lingered for hours. Yet these same waters possessed healing properties that drew the afflicted from great distances, skin conditions that had resisted all other treatments, showed improvement after exposure to the bitter sea, while joint ailments that had crippled their sufferers for years found relief in waters that seemed to concentrate the very essence of the earth's medicinal power. This paradox, water that could heal and harm in equal measure, became another element in the growing legend surrounding the site. Divine judgment, it seemed, operated according to principles that transcended simple categories of blessing and curse, creating from destruction itself new forms of mercy for those who approached with proper reverence and understanding. The trade routes that had once terminated in Sodom's prosperous markets began to bend around the cursed ground, creating new patterns of commerce that would reshape the economic geography of the ancient Near East. Merchants who had grown wealthy, carrying goods to and from the cities of the plain, found themselves forced to develop new relationships and establish different networks, their expertise in dealing with vanished customers suddenly worthless. Some entrepreneurs recognized opportunity in catastrophe, offering guide services to pilgrims seeking to visit the site of divine intervention. Others established way stations at safe distances from the ruins, providing food and shelter for travelers, whose journeys now required longer routes around the devastated region. The economic disruption caused by the city's destruction rippled through trade networks that had taken centuries to establish. Goods that had been manufactured in specialized workshops now disappeared from markets, while services that had been performed by experts trained in the valley's unique conditions could no longer be obtained at any price. Governments throughout the region found themselves forced to revise their strategic planning as the geopolitical balance shifted in response to the overnight elimination of a major center of wealth and power. Military alliances that had been based on access to the valley's resources became obsolete, while diplomatic relationships that had been carefully cultivated over generations suddenly lost their foundation. As weeks turned to months and the immediate shock of destruction began to fade, the work of interpretation intensified. Priests and prophets, philosophers and storytellers all struggled to extract meaning from events that exceeded every category of normal human experience. What they created through this process would become the foundation for religious traditions that would influence human thought for millennia to come. The story that emerged from their collective efforts bore only passing resemblance to the cosmic collision that had actually occurred. Physics had been transformed into theology. Natural disaster had become moral instruction, and random astronomical event had evolved into precisely targeted divine judgment that demonstrated eternal principles governing the relationship between human behavior and cosmic consequence. In the growing silence that settled over the salt-white wasteland, where nothing would grow and no life could flourish, the greatest religious narrative in human history took root in soil too poisoned to support any other form of existence. The cities were gone, their walls scattered like broken dreams across a landscape that would serve forever as monument to the terrible price of moral failure. But their story was just beginning its journey through human consciousness, carrying with it lessons that would echo until the stars themselves grew cold, and the last human voice fell silent in praise or condemnation of the night, when fire fell from heaven to judge the earth. In the hills surrounding the salt-white wasteland, where refugees gathered around fires that seemed pale and insignificant compared to the conflagration they had witnessed, the first tellings began. Voices shook as survivors attempted to put into words experiences that challenged the very foundations of human language. How could mortal tongues describe the moment when the sky itself had caught fire? What phrases could contain the memory of walls built to last forever, crumbling like sand in a child's hand? Lot sat among them, his weathered face reflecting firelight that reminded everyone present of flames far more terrible. His daughters pressed close beside him, their eyes still wide with shock at the loss of everything they had known. When he spoke of the strangers who had visited his house, his voice carried weight that made even the most skeptical listeners lean forward in attention. "They were not men," he whispered, his words barely audible above the crackling of burning wood. Their eyes held starlight, and when they spoke, the very air trembled. They knew what was coming before the first streak appeared in the sky. They knew, and they tried to save us all. Around other fires, different versions of the same impossible story took shape. A merchant who had fled Gomorrah in the final hours spoke of dreams that had driven him from his bed, visions of celestial messengers warning him to take his family and run toward the mountains. A trader from Admar described how his horses had refused to enter the settlement that final day, their wild eyes rolling white with terror at something invisible to human perception. Each account added details that the others lacked, fragments of truth that would eventually coalesce into narrative structures capable of bearing the weight of moral instruction. The cosmic visitor racing through space became a sword of divine judgment wielded by the hand of the Almighty. The petroleum fires ignited by celestial impact transformed into sulfur and brimstone falling like rain from heaven's arsenal. Within weeks, these stories had begun their journey beyond the immediate circle of witnesses. Ishmaelite traders, those wandering merchants whose caravans connected distant kingdoms, carried the tales along routes that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Each retelling refined the narrative, stripping away details that seemed merely coincidental, while emphasizing elements that spoke to universal moral principles. In Egypt, where scribes recorded everything that might affect the kingdom's stability, court chroniclers noted reports of divine intervention in the lands beyond their eastern borders. The destruction of such wealthy trading partners would have economic implications, but more importantly, it demonstrated that even the mightiest cities could fall when they offended cosmic justice. Pharaoh's counselors debated the meaning of these events in halls decorated with treasures that had once flowed from the valley of the Jordan. If gods could indeed level cities in a single night, what did this portend for their own empire? Their priests consulted ancient texts and offered reassurances that Egypt's righteousness would protect it from similar fate. But privately, many wondered if their confidence was justified. Mesopotamian kings received similar reports through their extensive intelligence networks. In Babylon, where astrologers studied the movements of celestial bodies with unprecedented precision, learned men attempted to correlate the destruction with unusual stellar alignments they had observed. Perhaps there were patterns in the dance of wandering stars that could predict when divine wrath would next fall upon human ambition. But it was among the Semitic tribes, those desert peoples who traced their lineage back to Abraham himself, that the story found its most fertile ground. Here, the tale of Sodom and Gomorrah merged with older traditions about the relationship between moral behavior and cosmic consequence. The cities became examples in a larger narrative about the covenant between heaven and earth, illustrations of principles that governed all human interaction with transcendent reality. The story's evolution followed patterns as old as human storytelling itself. Geographic details that seemed irrelevant to the moral lesson gradually faded from memory, while supernatural elements that emphasized the tale's spiritual significance grew more elaborate with each retelling. The asteroid became an angel of destruction, its cosmic fire transformed into the very breath of divine judgment. Lot's visitors, who had probably been nothing more than wandering holy men, with enough astronomical knowledge to predict the approaching impact, evolved into beings of pure celestial light, whose every word carried the authority of heaven itself. Their warning to flee the cities became divine command, backed by omniscient foreknowledge of exactly when and how judgment would fall. The geological transformation of the Jordan Depression, caused by the mechanical effects of cosmic impact on petroleum-rich sediments, was reinterpreted as direct intervention by the Creator in the natural order. The bitter sea that filled the crater became a permanent monument to divine justice, its lifeless waters serving as eternal reminder of what befell those who chose corruption over righteousness. Most significantly, the story began to serve purposes that transcended mere historical record. Desert tribes used it to teach their children about the importance of hospitality, pointing to Lot's salvation as proof that kindness to strangers could mean the difference between life and death when divine judgment swept across the land. The tale became a cornerstone of moral education, its vivid imagery burning lessons into young minds more effectively than any abstract philosophical discourse. Religious leaders recognized in the story a powerful tool for maintaining social order. When community members began to stray from traditional values, elders would invoke the fate of the cities as warning of what happened to societies that abandoned the ancient ways. The destruction became a standard against which all moral decay could be measured, a cautionary tale that made theoretical consequences immediate and terrifying. Prophetic voices throughout the region began incorporating references to the catastrophe into their oracles of warning and judgment. When Isaiah spoke against the corruption of Jerusalem, he evoked the memory of brimstone falling from heaven. When Ezekiel condemned the pride of nations, he reminded his listeners of walls that had seemed impregnable until divine fire reduced them to ash and salt. The story's moral framework expanded beyond its original context to encompass universal principles of justice and mercy. Abraham's bargaining with the Almighty for the lives of the righteous became a template for intercessory prayer, demonstrating that even divine wrath could be tempered by compassion for the innocent. The destruction of the cities established that justice would ultimately prevail, while the salvation of Lot's family proved that mercy remained available to those who chose it. As generations passed and direct witnesses died, the transformation from historical account to sacred narrative accelerated. Details that had once been preserved because they carried the authority of eyewitness testimony were now judged by different criteria. Did they serve the story's moral purpose? Did they illuminate eternal truths about the relationship between human behavior and cosmic consequence? Elements that survived this process of refinement became canonical, fixed points around which all other details would organize themselves. The cities had been wealthy beyond measure, but morally bankrupt. Strangers had come with warnings that were ignored by the sophisticated but heeded by the righteous. Fire had fallen from heaven with surgical precision, destroying only those who deserved destruction while sparing the humble and obedient. The role of natural forces in the catastrophe faded from memory, as supernatural explanations proved more satisfying to audiences seeking moral instruction rather than scientific understanding. The asteroid's impact became the direct action of divine will, its cosmic origins irrelevant to listeners who needed to understand why such things happened rather than how they occurred. Professional storytellers, those bards and reciters who preserved cultural memory through oral tradition, began shaping the tale according to the formal requirements of their craft. Narrative elements that served dramatic purposes were emphasized and elaborated, while details that slowed the story's momentum or confused its moral clarity were simplified or eliminated entirely. The account developed the rhythmic patterns and memorable phrases that would ensure its survival through countless retellings. Key speeches were polished until they achieved poetic perfection, while crucial scenes were structured to create maximum emotional impact on audiences who would hear rather than read the story. Within these formal constraints, the basic narrative achieved the stability that would carry it through centuries of transmission. Sodom and Gomorrah had defied heaven through their moral corruption. Divine messengers had offered final warnings that were rejected by the proud but accepted by the humble. Celestial fire had consumed the cities in a single night, creating a wasteland that would serve forever as monument to the certainty of cosmic justice. The story's integration with broader religious traditions gave it additional layers of meaning that resonated across different cultural contexts. It became a parallel to Noah's flood, demonstrating that divine judgment could take many forms while serving the same ultimate purpose of purifying creation from corruption. It complemented the Tower of Babel narrative, showing what happened to human pride when it reached the point where divine intervention became necessary. Most importantly, the tale established patterns that would be repeated throughout religious literature for millennia to come. The righteous would be warned before judgment fell. The wicked would have opportunities to repent that they would refuse to take. Divine justice would be executed with precision that spared the innocent while ensuring that guilt received its due punishment. These patterns provided frameworks for understanding later catastrophes and interpreting contemporary events. When cities fell to human enemies, observers could recognize the hand of cosmic justice at work through earthly agents. When natural disasters struck communities known for their moral failures, the destruction of the cities of the plain offered interpretive keys for understanding why such things were permitted to occur. The story's theological implications continued to evolve as different communities adapted it to serve their particular needs. Some emphasized the theme of hospitality, using Lot's protection of strangers to reinforce cultural values about treatment of travelers and foreigners. Others focused on the dangers of prosperity, pointing to the city's wealth as evidence that material success could become spiritually corrupting, if not balanced by moral responsibility. Still others found in the tale confirmation of beliefs about the afterlife and final judgment. If divine justice could level entire cities in response to moral failure, what did this suggest about the fate awaiting individuals who chose similar paths? The story became evidence for cosmic accountability that transcended earthly consequences, proof that moral choices had significance extending far beyond their immediate effects. By the time the account achieved literary form in sacred texts, its transformation from eyewitness testimony to mythological narrative was complete. The cosmic collision that had actually destroyed the cities lived on only in the physical evidence that remained scattered across the lifeless wasteland. Fragments of green glass, salt formations, and bitter waters that would puzzle future generations of observers. What survived in human memory was something far more powerful than historical record, a perfect moral allegory that illustrated eternal truths about justice and mercy, pride and humility, the terrible price of defying heaven, and the infinite value of choosing righteousness, even when it required sacrifice of everything the world considered precious. The fire that had fallen from space to consume the cities of the plain now burned eternal in human consciousness, transformed from random astronomical event into the most enduring cautionary tale ever preserved in the literature of civilization. Its flames would illuminate moral instruction for every generation that followed, ensuring that the cosmic accident which had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah would live forever as humanity's greatest story of divine judgment, exercised with perfect justice tempered by limitless mercy. Old Keturah's voice cracked like desert wind through stone canyons as she spoke the words her grandmother had whispered to her 70 winters ago. The children pressed closer to the dying embers, their eyes wide with the terror and wonder that only the very young could feel. when hearing how the sky had opened to pour out judgment upon the earth. "They came as men," she rasped, her gnarled fingers tracing patterns in the sand that looked like flames reaching upward. But Lot saw their true faces when the mob pressed close. Eyes like burning stars, skin that held light within it, voices that made the very stones tremble. A boy no older than 8 leaned forward. "What did they look like, grandmother?" Keturah smiled with teeth worn smooth by decades of grinding grain and chewing leather. "Beautiful as morning, terrible as storm fire. When they struck the wicked blind, their hands moved like lightning splitting the dark." This was how the tale lived and breathed and grew, not in scrolls locked away in temple chambers, but in the throats of storytellers who had never learned to read, whose memories held treasures no scribe could capture. Each telling breathed new life into ancient words. Each listener carried the fire a little further into the future. The story had already traveled further than arrows could fly or horses could gallop. Caravaneers told it at oases, where date palms offered shade to merchants from a dozen nations. Ship captains shared it in harbour taverns, where wine loosened tongues and gold loosened purses. Slaves whispered it in quarters, where masters never ventured, passing hope from mouth to mouth, like water in drought. In the palace courts of Memphis, Egyptian priests recorded fragments of the tale on papyrus scrolls that would crumble to dust before the story itself grew old. But their written words captured only shadows. The real power lived in voices that rose and fell like wind through wheat fields, that painted pictures no brush could match. "Tell us about Abraham," the children would beg, and Keturah's eyes would grow distant as she reached back through the long chain of telling to find the words that had been polished smooth by countless tongues. The old patriarch stood before the Lord of all creation, like a shepherd counting sheep, she would say, her voice dropping to barely more than breath. 50 righteous souls. Would you spare them for 50? 45. The numbers fell like stones into deep water, each one carrying the weight of prayer itself. But the story was changing, even as she spoke it. Details that had seemed important to her grandmother, the exact price of bitumen in Damascus markets, the names of lesser merchants who had perished. These faded like footprints in blowing sand. What remained burned brighter. The knock upon Lot's door in darkness, the mob's hungry voices, the moment when heaven's patience finally broke like overstretched rope. Young warriors heard one version around campaign fires, where sword points gleamed red in flickering light. Their storytellers spoke of divine armies sweeping down from celestial heights, of battles fought with weapons forged from lightning and thunder. The cities became enemy fortresses that no earthly force could breach, until heaven itself took the field. Mothers told a different tale to daughters, learning the weight of hospitality and the price of kindness. In their version, Lot's protection of strangers became the thread that pulled him and his family from destruction's path. The story warned against trusting appearances, while teaching that righteousness often wore simple clothes and carried humble bundles. Kings heard still another telling in throne rooms, where gold leaf caught torchlight and precious stones winked like captured stars. Court storytellers spoke of divine justice that could reach through palace walls and royal guards to strike down those who oppressed the innocent. No crown provided protection from judgment that came with authority beyond all earthly power. The tale spread north into lands where snow fell and rivers ran swift with mountain water. Celtic bards wove it into longer songs about gods who walked among mortals, while Germanic storytellers found in it echoes of their own legends about the end of worlds. and the cleansing fires that would burn away corruption. It traveled east along silk routes, where camels carried treasures between empires that rose and fell, like waves upon distant shores. Buddhist monks found parallels with their teachings about karma and consequence, while Persian fire priests recognized their own beliefs about purification through flame. But nowhere did the story take deeper root than among the Hebrew tribes, where it became foundation stone for everything else they built in word and deed. Here, Abraham was not merely ancient patriarch, but father of their people, his bargaining with the Almighty the pattern for every prayer that rose from lips that called upon the God of their fathers. The two visitors who had walked Sodom's streets became messengers of the same divine presence that had spoken to Moses from burning bushes and guided wandering feet through wilderness toward promised lands. Their mission was part of larger purpose that stretched from creation's dawn to judgment's final trumpet. Lot himself grew in stature with each generation that remembered his story. No longer simply Abraham's nephew who had chosen unwisely, he became righteous man, maintaining faith in faithless surroundings. His protection of strangers, despite mortal danger, established law that no Hebrew child would forget. Hospitality was sacred duty that could mean difference between life and death when divine testing came. His wife's transformation into salt became warning, carved deeper than stone into tribal memory. Looking back meant death, not just physical destruction, but spiritual dissolution that left nothing but mineral monument to mark where living soul had been. The lesson was clear. When heaven commanded movement, hesitation was fatal luxury. Temple singers began weaving the tale into psalms that praised divine justice while pleading for divine mercy. Their lyrics captured the story's rhythm, the building tension as corruption reached its peak, the sudden intervention of heavenly power, the awesome silence that followed judgment's completion. Prophets used the city's names like sword strokes against contemporary corruption. When Jerusalem's priests grew fat on temple offerings, while widows starved in shadows of holy walls, the memory of Sodom's fate cut through comfortable delusions. When kings trusted in foreign alliances rather than righteous governance, Gomorrah's ashes whispered warnings that power built on sand would not endure. The story became measuring stick for all other stories, template for understanding how divine justice operated in human affairs. Cities fell, kingdoms crumbled, peoples scattered. But observers who knew the tale of the burning plain could recognize familiar patterns, see beyond apparent chaos to moral order that governed all things. Scribes finally began committing the words to parchment and papyrus, creating written versions that would outlast the voices that had carried them. But even in written form, the story retained the rhythms of spoken telling, the repetitions that helped memory, the dramatic pauses that heightened tension, the vivid imagery that painted pictures in minds that had never seen the things described. Each scribe added his own touches, emphasized different details according to his understanding of what the story meant. Some stressed Abraham's intercession, others focused on Lot's righteousness, still others highlighted the city's corruption. But all preserved the essential structure that had emerged from centuries of telling: warning given, warning rejected, judgment executed with precision that spared innocent while consuming guilty. The written versions spread through communities that could afford scribes and schools, reaching audiences that oral tradition alone could never touch. Priests read the tale aloud in temples where hundreds gathered to hear words they could not read themselves. Teachers used it to instruct students in reading while imparting moral lessons that would guide their steps through life. Translations carried the story into languages whose speakers had never heard of Abraham or Lot, had never seen deserts where salt formations gleamed white as bone under merciless suns. But the tale's power transcended cultural boundaries. Every people knew corruption, every tribe understood justice, every tongue had words for warning and consequence. Greek philosophers found in the account confirmation of their beliefs about cosmic order and moral law. Roman jurists saw precedent for justice that operated according to universal principles rather than local customs. Christian missionaries used it to demonstrate God's hatred of sin, balanced by his love for sinners who would turn from their evil ways. By the time the story achieved its final form in sacred scripture, it had become something unprecedented, a narrative that belonged to all humanity while remaining rooted in specific historical moment. The cosmic collision that had actually destroyed the cities lived on in twisted metal and green glass, in salt-crusted wasteland and bitter waters that burned the tongue. But the story itself had transcended its origins to become eternal truth about the relationship between moral choice and cosmic consequence. Fire had fallen from heaven, not just once in the Jordan Valley, but every time corruption reached the point where divine patience could endure no more. The tale would outlive the empires that preserved it, outlast the languages that carried it, survive the destruction of the very cities where scribes first wrote it down. Its flames would burn as long as human voices could speak, and human hearts could understand the terrible beauty of justice perfectly balanced with mercy. In the end, that was the miracle, greater than any cosmic collision. How random astronomical accident had become purposeful divine action. How natural disaster had transformed into moral instruction. How the destruction of two forgotten cities had given birth to a story that would illuminate human conscience until the last star burned cold in empty sky. Silence ruled the wasteland with absolute authority. Where 10,000 voices had once risen in commerce and corruption, where children's laughter had echoed through streets paved with prosperity, where merchants had called their wares in dozen different tongues, now only wind spoke, whispering secrets to salt formations that would never answer back. The cursed valley had settled into its eternal role as monument to divine judgment. Centuries rolled past like desert storms, each season adding another layer of sand to bury what remained of walls that had once scraped the dome of heaven. Time itself seemed to move differently here, as if the cosmic fire that had consumed the cities had also burned away the normal relationship between past and present. Drifting sand covered the scars slowly but inevitably. What the celestial impact had shattered, what the petroleum fires had melted into strange new shapes, now disappeared beneath waves of dust that advanced and retreated according to wind patterns older than human memory. The earth was reclaiming its own, hiding evidence of both human pride and cosmic judgment beneath a blanket of forgetfulness. Yet the land refused to heal completely. Plants that took root in the mineral-poisoned soil grew twisted and stunted, their leaves bearing colors that had no names. Springs that bubbled up from deep places carried water too bitter for any living thing to drink, while salt crystals bloomed from the ground like flowers made of pure sorrow. Birds flying over the wasteland changed course without understanding why, their ancient instincts still recognizing something wrong in the electromagnetic signature that lingered in stone and sand. Creatures guided by navigation systems older than human civilization found their inner compasses spinning wildly above ground that had been touched by forces from beyond the edge of earthly experience. Only the bitter sea itself bore witness to the magnitude of what had occurred. Its waters, dense with minerals that had been fused in temperatures exceeding any earthly furnace, supported no life more complex than the hardiest bacteria. Nothing swam in its depths, nothing flew above its surface, nothing grew along its shores except salt formations that caught light like crystallized tears. But pilgrims came anyway, drawn by stories that grew more powerful with each generation. They traveled from the ends of the known world to stand where heaven's fire had fallen. Merchants from Babylon, priests from Egypt, philosophers from Greece, all sought the place where divine judgment had written its signature across the face of the earth, in letters too large for human minds to fully comprehend. They found a landscape that matched no earthly category. The salt pillar that had been Lot's wife still stood sentinel over the ruins, her crystallized form unmarked by weather or time, eternal warning against the fatal attraction of looking back towards sin. Some claimed her face still bore expressions of loss and longing, while others swore they could see tears that never fell traced in mineral streams down her cheeks. Jeremiah the prophet walked these shores in later years, his eyes seeing visions that burned like brands across his soul. Here among the silence and desolation, he found words for oracles that would echo through temples until the end of time. Everyone who passes by will be appalled and will scoff because of all its wounds, he wrote, his phrases capturing both the physical devastation and the spiritual meaning it carried. As when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighboring towns, declared the Lord, so no one will live there, no people will dwell in it. The prophecy was already fulfilled in the emptiness that stretched from horizon to horizon, in the absence of every sound that had once made this valley pulse with human energy. Ezekiel found different inspiration in the wasteland's terrible beauty. Standing where Gomorrah's fountains had once sung symphonies in marble courtyards, he saw in the silence a parable about pride that reached too high and prosperity that forgot its source. His visions transformed the ancient destruction into prophecy about future judgments, proving that the fire which had fallen here would fall again wherever human arrogance demanded divine response. The ruins themselves told stories to those who possessed eyes to read them. Foundations of buildings twisted into impossible shapes spoke of heat that had exceeded every earthly comparison. Green glass fragments scattered among the rubble carried within their structure proof that sand itself had melted and reformed in the cosmic furnace that had briefly burned hotter than the surface of stars. Travelers gathered these fragments as relics, carrying them to distant lands as tangible proof that the stories they had heard were more than mere legend. Temple treasuries from Egypt to Mesopotamia acquired collections of the strange green glass, while kings paid fortunes for samples of salt that had crystallized in temperatures no earthly fire could produce. Each relic became seed from which new tellings of the story would grow. A fragment of twisted metal displayed in a temple prompted questions that required the full narrative to answer. A crystal of pure salt presented to a foreign court opened conversations about divine justice that would influence the legal codes of nations. The physical evidence served purposes that went beyond mere curiosity or religious devotion. In an age when written records were scarce and literacy was rare, these tangible remnants provided proof that the extraordinary claims made by the story's tellers had foundation in observable reality. Skeptics could examine the green glass, taste the bitter water, touch the salt formations, and discover that the material world itself testified to events that transcended normal human experience. But the land's greatest testimony was its emptiness. Season after season passed without harvest. Year after year brought no sound of human habitation. Generation after generation found the valley as lifeless as the day after the fire fell. This persistent desolation spoke more eloquently than any relic about the magnitude of divine judgment and the permanence of cosmic justice. Trade routes that had once terminated in Sodom's prosperous markets continued to bend around the cursed ground. creating new patterns of commerce that would reshape the economic geography of the ancient world for millennia to come. Merchants who had grown wealthy, carrying goods to and from the cities of the plain, found their expertise suddenly worthless, their knowledge of vanished customers mere memory in a world that had moved beyond their understanding. Some entrepreneurs recognized opportunity even in catastrophe. Guide services emerged to lead pilgrims safely to the ruins and back, while way stations were established at carefully measured distances from the wasteland's edge. The destruction that had ended one form of prosperity had created another, proving that even divine judgment could be transformed into human enterprise by minds clever enough to see potential in desolation. Yet those who dwelt too close to the cursed valley reported dreams that carried visions of fire falling from clear skies, nightmares that featured cities burning with flames that gave no warmth. The land itself seemed to remember the cosmic violence that had reshaped it, broadcasting psychic echoes that sensitive souls could perceive across vast distances of space and time. Ancient mysteries concentrated around certain locations where the evidence of supernatural intervention was most obvious. Circles of fused sand marked spots where individual fragments of the cosmic visitor had struck Earth, creating impact craters too small to be seen from any distance, yet too perfect to be explained by natural forces. These sites became shrines where the faithful gathered to pray, and the curious came to wonder at works that surpassed human understanding. The bitter sea continued to yield treasures as strange as any found on dry land. Chunks of pure sulfur, crystallized in forms that suggested supernatural origin, washed up on shores where no living thing could survive. Travelers carried these yellow fragments to distant courts as proof of the brimstone that had fallen like rain from heaven's arsenal. Physical confirmation of descriptions that might otherwise have been dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Weather patterns in the region remained permanently altered by the cosmic impact. Winds that had once carried gentle breezes now moved with violence that could strip flesh from bone, while temperatures fluctuated between extremes that made sustained habitation impossible. The very atmosphere seemed poisoned by memory of the celestial fire that had burned away more than mere buildings and human lives. Astrologers and astronomers from across the ancient world came to study the site, hoping to correlate the destruction with celestial events they could identify in their star charts and planetary observations. They found patterns that seemed to suggest connections between cosmic movements and earthly catastrophes, discoveries that would influence their understanding of how heaven and earth interacted through forces both natural and supernatural. These learned investigations produced treatises that attempted to reconcile observed evidence with theological necessity. The wandering star that had actually caused the destruction was reinterpreted as divine instrument, guided by supernatural intelligence toward targets chosen for their moral significance, rather than mere astronomical convenience. Such explanations satisfied both scientific curiosity and religious requirement, proving that truth could be approached through multiple pathways. The valley's role as pilgrimage destination ensured that the story would never fade from human memory. Each generation of visitors carried away not just physical relics, but renewed commitment to preserving the narrative that explained what they had witnessed. The ruins became library, where lessons about divine justice were written in languages of stone and salt, metal and glass, texts that could be read by eyes that had never learned to decipher written words. Kings made state visits to the wasteland, bringing with them chroniclers and scribes whose records would preserve official recognition of the destruction's reality and significance. These royal expeditions lent governmental authority to religious tradition, ensuring that the story would be remembered not just in temples and tribal gatherings, but in the formal histories that recorded the deeds of nations. military commanders brought soldiers to stand where heaven's fire had demonstrated power that exceeded all earthly weapons. Veterans of 100 battles found themselves awed by destruction that surpassed anything human warfare could achieve, while young recruits learned lessons about the ultimate futility of trusting in mere military strength when cosmic forces were arrayed against them. The wasteland became classroom, where each generation could learn firsthand about the relationship between moral choice and physical consequence. Children who might have dismissed the story as ancient legend when told around distant fires found themselves believers when confronted with evidence their own eyes could examine. The ruins taught lessons that no teacher could match, imparted understanding that no book could contain. Yet perhaps the most profound testimony was the story's survival itself. Empires rose and fell, languages evolved and died, entire civilizations disappeared beneath the sand. But the tale of the cities that defied heaven continued to burn bright in human consciousness. The cosmic accident that had destroyed 2 forgotten settlements had given birth to narrative that proved more durable than any monument human hands could build. The fire that had fallen from space continued to burn in human hearts, transformed from random astronomical event into eternal truth about the relationship between righteousness and divine favor. Its flames illuminated moral instruction for every generation, ensuring that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would live forever as humanity's greatest story of justice executed with precision that spared the innocent while consuming the guilty. In the end, that was the true miracle. Not that cities had burned in celestial fire, but that their burning had created light that would never be extinguished. The wasteland would endure until the end of time, as monument to both human folly and divine mercy, its silence speaking more eloquently than any voice about the eternal consequences of choices made in moments that seemed to matter only to those who made them. The ruins slept beneath accumulating sand, but the story they had birthed would wake with every sunrise, rise with every prayer, burn with every conscience that recognized in the ancient destruction a mirror reflecting its own moral choices. The cosmic collision was over, but the legend it had created would continue until the last human voice fell silent in the growing dark.